Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that gives you all the facts to talk about while the turkey thaws in the sink. You can find out more about us at tertiumquids.org and go to YouTube. We have a channel full of all the archives of all the programs that we've done here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. We kick off this week with the story that has dominated so much discussion, the impeachment advisability hearings in Washington. And to join us to take us inside of it a little bit, Casey Burgat, resident senior fellow with the Governance Project at R Street. You find out more about them at rstreet.org. Casey, thank you for taking some time out with us this week. How are you doing?
So far, so good, but it's only Monday, so we'll see how that goes.
So let me jump in on what has bugged me about this from the get-go. And I was told by several of my legal friends, I live in Charlottesville, and there's a school that purports to teach law around here. So we have a lot of hot and cold running lawyers, that applying the same rule to a president of the United States that you would apply to a kid in the poor part of any town USA. If somebody called the police and said, I think so-and-so, stole a car, and then the police take them in on the hearsay, and then the judge tells the defense lawyer, no, you can't mount any kind of defense. We're just going to go and I'm going to hear what the people are telling the police and what the police saw. But that's not fair because the rights conveyed onto a citizen are different than the ones conveyed on the chief executive of the United States. Is that correct?
Right. So the only thing that I would push back on is that to use your analogy, the car being stolen or the reporting of a car being stolen was investigated. And I think that we would agree that you want that report investigated. So
Sure.
The Democrats took the report being issued, and then it opened up an investigation on those topics. And that's what was done behind closed doors to see if there was corroboration of that complaint. They went out and found witnesses. They saw all the complaints leveled against the president and his actions, and then they found the people that can actually speak to those issues because the one making the initial report couldn't. So that's the alternative. That's the better analogy of where we're at in this process.
So is there actually going to be a crime, or because of the ambiguity of the high crimes and misdemeanors in the Constitution regarding impeachment, is it still really open to the interpretation of Congress, the House anyway, as to what they think might be impeachable?
Yeah, it's only open to the interpretation of the sitting members at this time. I think it was Gerald Ford who said that impeachment, though it is listed very vaguely in the Constitution of high crimes and misdemeanors, impeachment is up to the people serving in the House at a given time. So if they decide it meets that threshold of high crimes, misdemeanors, then that's what will go forward. It is a political process and not one that is played out in court at all.
So if I understand it, and many of my listeners were upset about the secret SCIF hearings, but because this involves the intelligence community and this statecraft apparatus, much of what's being discussed is stuff that we're, I guess, not supposed to know about because it is the ultimate in sausage-making government style. We want you to enjoy the sausage, and you'll do it more if you just don't see how we make it.
Right.
But is this really the secret to what the president has done? Is he's rent open, whether it's George Washington's international entanglements or Dwight Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, to expose them to the public scrutiny, and they're pushing back against it?
Right. I don't know how much of it is that. I think that there is the national security component. A lot of this is done with foreign affairs. So you can see why they would want to have at least, or even by law, need to have some of these meetings behind closed doors. But even more simple than that is the explanation that they have a lot of different witnesses coming in, and they want to hear their stories individually, just like you question someone independent of another potential accessory. You want to get their independent stories to see if there's corroboration or to see if there is differences in that story, which tells you even more than a lot of times corroboration. But so that's why they're being done behind closed doors, just like within Nixon's and Clinton's impeachment proceedings, which were done by a special counsel. before the public hearings, the public wasn't privy to those information sessions either. So there are connections to be made to those previous efforts, even though the Republicans have done a really good job at making the case that the president hasn't been afforded his right to this point.
I think it was Jim Jordan that asked Ambassador Taylor, and I forget Kent was the other witness. Could you point to anything impeachable in what they had heard? Because at that point, it was even almost to the point of sounding like the lyrics to an REO Speedwagon song, where Taylor is telling his testimony is that one of his staffers overheard half of a phone conversation as he walked by the Oval Office that disquieted him, and it was none of it. It was even first person. Never mind, as Jim Jordan asked, is any of this, in their opinion, impeachable? Was that a fair question? It doesn't sound like it was necessarily fair, because it's really on Jim Jordan to decide amongst his fellows.
Right. I think that moment was done by Representative Radcliffe of
Okay.
Texas. So, which it doesn't matter. The question still remains if this is a fair question. And those witnesses came forth, and in their opening statements, they were very clear about how they didn't want to take a position on any of this. It is not their job. There's no good outcome for them that can come from actually taking a political position on this. And then to ask them a question to point out what is impeachable here. It's not a fair statement. It's not their judgment to make. They were only there as fact witnesses, and Republicans have really taken hold of their non-answer as a form of supporting their position that there is nothing impeachable here. But I think that in private they may have different opinions on what was impeachable, or if it hit that threshold, but they, of course, were not, as current public officials, not going to take that place or make that statement in front of that hearing.
Casey Burgat, senior fellow with the Governance Project at rstreet, rstreet.org is where you can find out more about it. He's got a piece up there about the first public impeachment hearings, a video blog or vlog, as I'm told they're supposed to be called. That's what the cool kids call them anyway.
That's right.
So next for my question is, I've heard a couple of the folks say in testimony that the president behaved inappropriately in his conversation with the president of Ukraine, and that there are channels by which this gets done. So I may be tying in on something very wonky, but it seems that the real push is that the president doesn't have the authority to make these sorts of discussions, that is for the State Department and kind of the career statecraft people. But isn't that really the role of the president is to dictate what is State Department policy, not the other way around?
Right. So the president, of course, has the hiring and firing authority to appoint any and all people that serve at the pleasure of him to implement his policy. That much is undisputed. What remains at question is the president has if he wants these investigations to be done, and we can debate whether that is his prerogative to actually do, or if it's worthy of the president, or all of those things. But if he wants these done, then there are actual agencies and apparatus to actually carry them out in the best interest of the United States. The counter to that is that people are saying if he does want these things done, and asking a foreign entity to provide them is a very different matter. We have agencies that do these things. They're well resourced to do these. They carry them out with the interest of the United States in mind. So to ask to kick that outside of the agencies that work for him is kind of the question, and what people will push back on, because then you're relying on a foreign nation who, by definition, doesn't have the best interest of the United States at heart in front of their own.
Is it also fair to say that this bureaucracy in many ways protects us from being just like a Venezuela or a Zimbabwe, where, whoever the guy in the big house gets to decide, on a whim what policy is, rather than sometimes slow and intractable, but there's a reason things go slowly in Washington, and much of it is designed around the idea of protecting our rights, that just the whims of somebody who may 4 or 8 years serve as president, can't just, dictate policy without going through those channels. Does the bureaucracy have a purpose, I guess, is what I'm getting at with this question?
Yeah, absolutely. And the bureaucracy, well, one thing is the president is stretched so thin, he's involved with so much that he actually needs these issue area experts to conduct his policy when his mind is on 150 different things at once. So it serves a purpose just in terms of expertise and just delegation authority. But you're right, it provides this buffer to slow down the decision-making process, to make sure that we're acting on our best interest, that we're getting informed opinions, that we don't just rely on a single individual that, as you say, can be out in 4 and 8 years, and then you have to redo the thing all over again. So I think that the witnesses, a huge takeaway from the first week of public hearings, is that the witnesses, these State Department officials, are actually really professional. They're really committed to their task. They serve their lifetimes in this, and they care about it, which is exactly the kind of people that you want in these positions, even if they do move slow and bureaucracy gets a bad name.
I've read the transcript several times, and I guess it was interesting to me, Casey, the one fact witness that said, I have something that's not in the transcript. It turned out to be a reference to the now famous video of Joe Biden at another D.C. area think tank bragging about getting the what ostensibly is Ukraine's attorney general fired in the midst of bringing a bag of U.S. aid to Ukraine. Is bringing this to light, this attitude of, whether it's quid pro quo or bribery or that kind of thing, good for the American people to see that this is often how the United States has to push out, our human rights agendas, whether it be, through sanction or through aid?
I'm a firm believer that the more we know about decision-making processes, the better. We can then ask voters to take a more informed position. And then even more so in campaigns, the policies are reduced to sound bites and such simple level decision-making that's hardly ever to be true. So when you give people a backdoor information about how decisions are actually carried out, what leverage points presidents can reasonably use, you get a more informed decision-making process, and I don't think that's ever a bad thing.
Is this also, and I'm wondering that, we've gone through the development of what they refer to as the royal presidency, pretty much from, maybe Eisenhower a little bit, but certainly Kennedy on up. The idea of this president is the leader of our nation rather than the executive of the governance that our Congress writes down for him. Is this a resetting of that in our minds, sort of similarly to the way the last time we had impeachment even discussed in the 70s, was that the presidency kind of took a backseat back down into the more appropriate constitutional role, and more people paid attention to Congress and their role? Right.
So this is a huge part of my job, and in fact why I get paid to talk about the issues where Congress has kind of heard and even given it away its legislating authority to the unitary executive. Congress is the place where people's interests are best represented. They have smaller constituencies. You're able to more impact the process with being one of, sending your particular member to Congress, whereas the president represents the entire country. So we are firm believers that Congress needs to reassert itself as the first branch, and it is the first branch for a reason, as a primary decision-making authority, and that the Congress has the ability to hold the president in check, just as it was intended. We're taught from our earliest days that it's 3 co-equal branches of government, each with a check on the other. But we've been through periods where the president has overreached in these efforts, and we're seeing that play out right now, even with something as simple as Congress is subpoenaing executive branch officials, and they have chosen a lot of times not to comply. So we're having these debates before our very eyes, and it's not great and it's not fun, but there are important processes that need to be reconciled.
Casey Burgat, resident senior fellow with the Governance Project at R Street. I've been hoping to ask somebody with your expertise this, because it's bothered me for, I guess it's really bubbled to the surface over the past year. We've just talked about the 400th anniversary of representative Republican-style government in the United States with the founding of the Jamestown House of Burgesses still operating 400 years later. But it struck me that there are just roughly a little bit more than 3 times as many Americans as there were 100 years ago. There are just about 3 times as many Virginians as there were 100 years ago, and yet the exact same number of representatives. Is it unfair for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives to try to represent 800,000 people? You talked about how they are the ones closer and they have smaller constituencies, but are we asking each representative to represent too many people? And I know I'm saying that I'd like the House to be bigger in terms of elected members, but maybe then we could put them in charge of some of these bureaucracies more directly, and they could actually have their advice and consent role. Is that crazy talk from a radio show host?
No, it's not crazy at all, and there's a lot of political scientists and a lot of political science research that says that we might have overstepped the size of our constituencies when we think about our representational role. That the ones we send to Congress, even in the members of as members of the House, they're representing 800,000 people, where on the founding, I think it was about 30,000.
Yeah.
So it's an absolute discrepancy in terms of representation, but it would be a big step to start expanding the House to getting back down to those more the smaller numbers that we saw in the past. And a lot of research suggests that it would do a lot to help with our polarization problem, to help with forming coalitions that are not just along party lines. So there's a lot of benefits that would come from that. But we are a two-party system. We are, for better or for worse, we've set our institutions up to reward D's and R's in certain places, and we've self-selected in a lot of different geographic locations and on issues that's a pretty big ask to take to expand the House, to expand the Senate, to get those constituencies back to where the Founding Fathers had them. But there's a lot of pros that can come of it, and so I'm not saying that it's a bad idea or a crazy one. It just might be tough to implement, as a lot of things are.
Well,
so
and sometimes the best things are as well. And I feel like there's a general feel. I look at a lot of opinion polls, and a lot of people feel disconnected from their representation anyway. And I think that would go a long way towards making it more likely that you know who your member of the House of Delegates or senators. And plus, you see this debate about the coming up census and then the redistricting. That becomes much more simple to keep continuous and connected communities together in representation, rather than having to stretch all the way across hills and dales and rivers and whatnot. Casey, what is your feel? What do you think that just based on the partisan nature of it, that this goes to the Senate for a hearing? And I'm hearing people, the impeachment discussion, that they will vote to write articles of impeachment, and then it'll send it over to the Senate for the trying of this. Do you think that the Senate hearings would be good or bad for the president, for the country? And do you think that this could be the first time we vote to actually remove a president from office under impeachment?
Right. So a lot there. So I'll try to take it piece by piece.
Go ahead. You have the floor.
All right, great. One, I think that the House is pretty committed to drafting up an articles of impeachment and then getting a vote on them. For one, it lets them show their constituents that they're trying to hold the president accountable for this scandal, among others. And then it also puts Republicans in the House on the record for a vote. We saw the first one outlining an inquiry that went straight along party lines, except for Republicans actually did get a few Democratic defectors. So people want to see where their representatives stand, and I think that the articles of impeachment vote that will ultimately come will do that. And given the House's majority with Democrats, they'll convict on at least one, formally impeaching the president. Then, of course, it goes over to the Senate for them to try the case. And then that will be more like a courtroom setting that we're so used to seeing, and you'll see that the House managers will present their case, and then Republicans will defend it, presided by the Chief Justice. So it will play out. In terms of if it's good for the country, I'm of two minds about that. One, I think it's good to actually see that the process actually plays out. We hear so much that this is rigged, it's a sham process, it's a witch hunt. Which just discredits the institutions, the ones that are going to exist long after all of these members move on. And when Trump leaves office, and if for whatever reason, whenever, that these things are going to work. independent of these, that even though we can trash them in public and discredit them, that they actually played out. And I think that's good to see, especially as you get young kids coming of age. I'm a teacher, and they're very invested in this process, and I love that it's actually playing out as it was intended to do when the framers in their genius laid it out over 200 years ago. So that's good. In terms of outcome, though, I think it's pretty predetermined. I think that there would be a lot of new information that would have to come out between now and a Senate trial to actually move the needle to get the threshold of senators, a lot of them Republican, to buck their party's president headed into an election year. A lot would have to change to actually vote on that removal. So I think the outcome is pretty predetermined, with the House impeaching and the Senate failing to remove the president.
I'm fascinated. You mentioned a couple of Democratic Party defectors in the first vote to move forward with it, given that there are an awful lot of folks who represent districts the president carried but are of different political parties. It could be that rare friction moment where you might actually see representatives standing on their own against it. Casey, it has been a joy catching up with you, and wish I had more time. We've got to get on to our next guest here, but keep up the great work there, and thank you for indulging my little fanciful run at the idea of perhaps more electeds and fewer bureaucrats, but it is.
You're not alone, I know that. Big ideas aren't bad ideas.
Well, thank you, sir, and you keep up the good work, and if we don't talk to you before then, have an awesome Thanksgiving.
Same to you.
And up next, Justin Haskins, research fellow at the Heartland Institute. He has a brand new book out just in time for Christmas gift giving, Socialism is Evil. I know you're making that Macaulay Culkin face, but no, he's really come up with a great tome on it, and we'll visit with him next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.